Okay, so it's apparently just you and I this morning, and I'm fine with that. Okay, so good morning, Felicia, and anybody else who wants to join. Welcome to our class on nepotism. For those who do not know me, I am your professor, your lecturer for this module, and I will guide you through the lesson for the day. So please note that we are recording the session so that I can paste a copy of the recording on the module site for those who are unable to attend. So before we commence with this session, let's first take a moment to reflect on what it is we want to achieve when working specifically through this unit. What I've reflected here on the screen, these are your outcomes, and it's also what I will assess you against. So you should be able to identify conduct that amounts to nepotism. You should be able to conduct an elementary investigation into an allegation of an incident of nepotism. You should be able to draft a report that details the investigation and findings and makes a recommendation for further actions based on the investigation. You should be able to identify and use the different terms and concepts that are relevant to the investigation of nepotism in your investigative report. And you should be able to explain the importance of company guidelines and their value in preventing nepotism. So nepotism, what is nepotism? I'm sure we've all heard this term in media reports, on social media, even on the news. Now, nepotism happens when a person gives a job or other benefit within a business or politics or even similar environments to a relative, despite the apparent unsuitability of the person for the appointment. Nepotism has a few relatives. I don't mean, no pun intended there, but there are a few related concepts that are closely associated with nepotism, but that are not exactly the same. These concepts are cronyism, patronage, favoritism, and Cada deployment. So we will look at them each as individual concepts and what they mean. So the first one is cronyism. Now, cronyism is very closely associated to nepotism. However, the primary difference here is that the person who receives the appointment or the unfair benefit is not a direct family member, but a friend. So let's say I'm friends with Jackson Matebula, and he and I go to the same church, and I know he's looking for a job, and I'm the HR manager at my company, and I know we're looking for somebody for specific position, and instead of going through the HR processes of advertising the post and doing what we are supposed to do, I appoint Jackson in the position. Jackson might be suitably qualified, but I mean, I haven't adhered to any of the policies. If I was so certain that Jackson is a candidate for the post, why don't I let him take part in a fair process in which he goes through the whole interview process? So cronyism, very closely associated with nepotism, except the person who gets the undue benefit is a friend and not a direct family member. The next one we look at is that of patronage. Now, you may have heard in some of the movies where they talk about a person as patron. Now, patron is the big boss. Now, patronage occurs when a powerful person, such as an MD or a CEO of a company, or even a committee of figures, makes sure that people who support them receive appointments and contracts. Now, I'm sure if you read this definition, you will recognize what we have come to witness in media reports, in news, because patronage is also rampant in political campaigns and political parties. The next one we deal with is that of favoritism, you know, the person who's your favorite. And that's why I have the star, teacher's pet. Now, favoritism in the workplace is when a person is promoted over the heads of others at the company for reasons other than job performance. So in other words, let's say Mildred works with me at the company and I like Mildred. I just like Mildred. Mildred helps me with things and Mildred is loyal. Mildred doesn't work very, very hard, but you know what? Whenever I need something, Mildred is always there. Mildred doesn't really get through all her work, but I like Mildred. So when the next promotions come up, I push and I promote Mildred because you know what? I want to keep Mildred because she's to my benefit. Now, sometimes this favoritism happens in an open way or in an underhanded way. Open displays of favoritism usually occur when a close relative is hired because of the relative, because the person is a relative, whereas the covert one, the one that's sort of secret, displays occurs when preferred resources are allocated to projects of where Mildred is associated with, or where assistance is given to Mildred and her department. So that is what happens when it's really a little bit hidden away. Favoritism may thus be displayed not only to family members in a workplace, but also people connected to the decision maker outside of the scope of the work environment. Some authors even define nepotism as favoritism to relatives and cronyism as favoritism to friends. So can you see how these concepts tend to overlap? And this is where the importance of policy comes in. Policy will have to explain and unpack what it means with these different terms. Now, the last one we will address is probably the most relevant in our current space. Now, you may recall that the last Zondo report that was issued made specific mention of Cada deployment, but not because it was a good and a sound political strategy. No, Cada deployment was mentioned because it was not only harmful, it was also unconstitutional. So what is Cada deployment? Well, Cada deployment occurs when loyal members of a certain group or a political party are appointed into independent bodies or government institutions so that the group or the political party can control that institution or body and further its own objectives, ideals, principles, or ideologies. We've seen this at Transnet, we've seen this at SABC, we've seen this at South African Airways. So this person called a Cada has to first put the group or the party ahead in all their decisions, and they are accountable to that group or party, not to the institution, not to the organization, not to the country. This Cada is expected to be more loyal to the group or the party than to the rule of law, the constitution, or the public. Cada deployment is sometimes confused with patronage and cronyism. And there is a link here in the slide. There you will see the link. If you want to, you can access that and go and read the article about the harmful nature of Cada deployment. I've also included 3 recent links to media reports on Cada deployment in our current situation and how the news media are reporting on Cada deployment. So let's go back to our original concept, that of nepotism. So where does it come from? What is the origin? Well, the origin dates back to, there are various views, but the one I found was the origin dates back to the 1600s, where you know, when the clergy in the Roman Catholic Church, they weren't allowed to get married. So when they were appointed into important positions, newly elected popes specifically, they often appointed family members, especially their nephews, into high positions in the church. And then they would surround themselves with nephews, loyal kinsmen, people who would support their views, support their agenda, support what they are doing. There is another definition that says the word nepo means nephew, and the ism, remember we spoke in absenteeism about what the ism means. The ism is part of a word that means a type of doctrine, theory, system, or practice. So in this instance, it's a specific practice that is ongoing. Another explanation for the origin of the term is derived from the Latin word nepos. Now you will see the first one is the Italian word nepo, and the second one is from the Latin word meaning nepos. Very, very closely related, which basically means grandchild or nephew. So they said that this is the practice of giving preferential treatment to nephews. And this occurred specifically in the late Middle Ages, where nephews are appointed to high church positions because the popes and the bishops took a vow of chastity. They couldn't have children, and in this way, they couldn't have a son. But because they then appointed a nephew or a grandchild from, let's say, a sister's side, they did not have their own sons, and therefore the nephew acts as a substitute as a son, but also in support of the person in the church. So I'm sure you can see at this stage what nepotism is aiming towards. But what is so bad about it? Well, what's so bad about it is it impacts negatively on the entire business because it affects all the people around the person being appointed. So the person being appointed, undue pressure is put on that person. That person must now perform and doesn't necessarily have the skills or insight to do what they are supposed to do. Then inevitably what happens, the person directly under this person on the hierarchy then has to do the work of the appointed nephew. And then the person that has to do the work gets angry because, I mean, why didn't you appoint me in the position? And it causes unhappiness within the entire workforce. Nepotism and its variants, cronyism, favoritism, patronage, and Cada deployment. These are universal phenomena. I don't think it happens just in South Africa. Parmalat, the company Parmalat, was in the media a few years ago because it was a semi-privately owned company, and the father appointed his daughter and his son in the company, and they basically managed the company into the ground. You may recall that Donald Trump, the previous president of the United States, appointed his son-in-law into a very high position in government. And that is also a form of nepotism. So these are all corrupt practices, and they manifest in different ways. Now, anti-corruption is the 10th of the UNGC principles. So Principle 10 stipulates that entities such as businesses, companies, should intentionally avoid all forms of corruption, which includes extortion and bribery. While numerous people are of the view that the worst crime in Africa is corruption, the damage caused by nepotism is often just as bad for the economy, but I think it's often underestimated. But remember that nepotism does not only involve employment, it seeps through into contracts and into tenders. We saw this so many times with the PPE tender scandals while we were going through COVID. Equality. So nepotism is directly in contrast to the principle of equality enshrined and promised by the Constitution. Since nepotism is favoritism shown to friends or family members of a person in power, It is in direct contravention of the Constitution. In the explanatory manual on the Code of Conduct for Public Service, it states explicitly that the practice of nepotism or favoritism is unfair. So Section 3 of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, Act 12 of 2004, refers to corruption as directly or indirectly receiving, accepting, or offering a benefit to another person, to act in a biased way that amounts to an abuse of a position of authority, and that is corruption. Now, nepotism is most certainly a form of corrupt practice, not only in South Africa. It's an absolute abuse of power, abusing your power to make sure that your family members are appointed, and in terms of cronyism or patronage, making sure that your friends or those who support you or your ideology are appointed. So how does one investigate an allegation into nepotism? Excuse me. Where do you start? So looking at the allegation, and then you look at policies. Usually, your letter of engagement, the letter that your line manager sends you, contains the relevant policy contravention. So more often than not, you will not have to look them up. Consider then what it is that you will have to prove. Now, if we base it on the case study in the book, you will need to prove that the process followed to appoint Miss Nyker was not fair and transparent and did not comply with policy. Thus, it's vital that in terms of aspects like appointing people into positions, promotions, and awarding tenders, your company has very, very clear policy guidelines. If they do not, you are setting yourself, the company is setting themselves up for problems going forward, because they will not be able to act against people who do these things within the company space. So how will you prove that the process did not comply with policy? Simply, you will investigate what was done, the process that was followed from the time the advertisement for the position was placed until the appointment was done. And then you will go through that process. If the appointment policy indicates that the company must do A, B, C, D, and E, but the company does B, C, D, A, E, then there is deviation from policy and procedure. In the case study, you will have to obtain the original advertisement in which the requirements for the post were spelled out. You must use the appointment policy as your compass and measure everything that was done against it. Where you find deviations, you must note it down. Day, date, time, and place are very important aspects in your report. They anchor what you do and what you find in terms of time and space. They also provide a chronological narrative of the steps you took in the investigation. So make sure when you do your report, day, date, time, place. Day, date, time, place. Vitally important. But I want to also remind you that often that these allegations are made against senior and powerful people in the company. And now you must do the investigation. So you will have to protect your investigation. You will have to protect your evidence. Report what you do every day to your line manager. Make backups of all the evidence you find. You can even go so far as to have a backup additional to what you tell your line manager, because you don't know, is your line manager maybe susceptible to being bribed later on in the investigation? So always make sure that you, and perhaps another colleague that you can trust absolutely. Know the gist of the investigation and where the evidence is kept. Act fast, because documents, reports, minutes, recordings of things like this have a habit of disappearing. So you will have to obtain the recordings of the shortlisting meetings, the recordings of the interview, the minutes of those interviews, all the documents associated with those interviews, where each panel member gave points or gave views or gave opinions. Get those reports as soon as possible. And then again, you will compare what was done versus what should have happened. And you have to highlight the gaps or the missteps or the deviations in your report. You may even find that the applicant for a position bribed the HR manager to get a position. And there are numerous media reports on jobs for cash. I know this has happened in SAPS. I've heard several students complain that when they go and hand in or they go and ask for the recruitment forms, they have to pay. When they go and hand in the recruitment forms, they have to pay. That is corruption. That cannot be permitted to continue. I know similar trends were spoken of in the education sector. Even making a misrepresentation on your CV to get a position while not nepotism is also problematic, as it amounts to fraud. And the use of electronic communication between parties is vital, as it may contain valuable evidence. Now, in the morning when I log onto my computer, there is an announcement that comes up, and I'll put it into the slide before I post it onto the system. And this notice tells me that my emails may be monitored in terms of company policy. Now, that will give the investigator right to go through my emails if there's an allegation of nepotism against me, or favoritism, or whatever the case might be. They may go through my work emails, and they may look for any evidence of misconduct on my part using my company laptop. If I have a company cell phone, exactly the same. Nothing on that is private because it belongs to the company. Ask yourself, what does the company policy say on the use of computers, the use of ICTs, the use of cell phones? Does the company have access? Does the company have the right of admission? To what extent is that which I do on my company laptop or a cell phone private or restricted? So those things are also very, very important to take a look at. There is an example of a policy on the prevention of nepotism in the study guide. This was taken from the website of the University of Stellenbosch in 2021, and it's an excellent example of a policy on procurement, a prevention of procurement. It shows various issues that you should be aware of and take into consideration if you have to investigate nepotism, especially if there's something irregular going on with a procurement. Remember always to obtain the employer organization's policy on nepotism. Look carefully at the wording, like the definition of a misconduct. It will contain the points that you will have to cover in an attempt to prove the matter. So let's take a look at a couple of things. So some definitions to consider may be, in terms of this, nepotism is the unfair favoring of relatives and household members. So here we have two things. We have relatives and we have household members. So what is a relative? Well, in terms of this policy, a relative normally includes husband, wife, son, daughter, mother, father, brother, sister. So there's your immediate. Then there's grandfather, grandmother, or grandchildren. In-laws. So any in-laws, father-in-law, mother-in-law, grandfather-in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, and even adopted children. Household members on the other side include all individuals that share a staff member's home on a regular basis. Now, the policy does not explain what regular basis means, but if somebody lives at your home, let's say 2 days out of the week, every week, I would say that's a regular person and a regular visitor, and makes that person a household member. And there you have a purchaser that refers to any staff member who acquires goods and or services for the organization. Now, inevitably, not all situations where nepotism may play a role can be listed in any policy. Where such situations arise, the principles arising from the previous paragraphs ought to form the basis of the policy and be applied equally. So one can never make provision for everything. Therefore, it's wise to have like an all-capturing section like this. Now, this is in that policy of Stellenbosch, to make provision for things that happen outside the specific definitions of the policy, but clearly against the principles contained in the policy. And therefore, it's important also to look at that, and that these be applied equally. So if one investigates person A and person B does exactly the same, person B should also be investigated. Okay, so that is the end of the lesson. But before we proceed, let's ask ourselves, to what extent will we be able to do the following? To what extent will we be able to explain the origin of the concept of nepotism, provide different definitions of nepotism, even your own definition, identify terms and concepts often associated with nepotism? Would you be able to explain the damage that nepotism may cause to the morale of an organization? Would you be able to explain the importance of anti-nepotism policies and identify conduct which may amount to nepotism? Would you be able to conduct an elementary investigation into an alleged incident of nepotism, and out of that be able to draft a report that details the investigations and the findings? And would you be able to make further recommendations? And would you be able to explain the importance of clear company guidelines and their value in the prevention of nepotism? Not only addressing, we want to prevent. So in other words, inform people that this is the type of things that the company does not permit. So these are the things you should be able to do at the end of this unit. And then we ask ourselves, are there any questions? So I'm going to open the floor now and ask if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask. If you must just unmute yourself and then you can ask and we can respond. Otherwise, you can write on the chat. If you do not feel that you want to ask on the forum. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions. I'm not seeing any chats. If there are no questions, then I'm going to assume you all understand what it is that we discussed, and you will be able to address the things of the outcomes of the unit. So I want to thank you all for attending our session today, and again tell the students that were unable to attend the session that you may access the recording, which I will post on the module site. Again, the module site works in a reverse billing format. So if you log onto your module site and you view your videos through your module site, the university receives your data bill, and the data will not be subtracted from your data package. I see we have a question coming in, so I'm just going to wait a moment. While we're waiting, I will also upload a copy of the PowerPoint presentation for you to use as you go through the recording. Some of you find it very helpful. I do not upload the PowerPoints before the time because I find sometimes students get distracted by what's in the PowerPoint, and therefore I upload it afterwards. Okay, we're just waiting for the message to come through. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording as it seems the message is taking a little bit longer than normal to come through. So I'm going to stop the recording. And then I'm going to bid the online lookers a very good day as I wait for the question to come through so that I can answer it. I will add information to the session if need be. Okay, guys, have an awesome day further. Goodbye.